Captain Derek Foss dropped the range report on the table without looking at who he was dropping it on. It landed in front of Clare Callahan with a sound like a small verdict, and he kept walking, kept talking to the men behind him, kept performing the specific theater of a senior officer who believes his presence is the most important variable in any room he enters. The pages scattered. Wind from the open hangar door took one of them. Callahan bent down and picked it up without a word, without a change in expression, without anything that could be read as reaction. She had learned, in the years before she arrived at Fort Calloway, that reaction is a resource. You spend it only when it costs the other person something. She was a ballistics analyst. That was what her assignment sheet said. That was what the base roster listed under her name: Specialist Clare Callahan, Ballistics and Trajectory Analysis, attached to the 114th Infantry Brigade's training cadre on a 90-day temporary assignment. Nobody had asked what the 90-day assignment was covering for. Nobody had asked why a woman of 31 with 11 years of service still carried the rank of specialist rather than something with more syllables. Nobody had asked about the 2 years that sat in her service record as classified redacted, reduced to a single line that read, "Special assignment, various locations, details restricted." She had come to Fort Calloway in October. It was February now. The range was the one place where the math was honest. Distance, wind, elevation, the Coriolis effect on a bullet traveling far enough that the Earth's rotation becomes a variable. These things did not care about rank or performance, or the particular self-regard of men who had decided early that confidence and competence were the same thing. The math was the math. The bullet went where the physics sent it, and the physics did not negotiate. Foss had been running the brigade's long-range qualification program for 3 years. He was a good trainer in the way that a calculator is a good calculator: fast, reliable within its design parameters, and entirely incapable of recognizing when the problem it was solving had exceeded its design. He ran the qualification program on a fixed curriculum that he had written himself and considered complete, which it was, in the way that a map drawn before a territory changes is complete. Accurate to its moment, increasingly wrong with every mile past it. Callahan had noticed the curriculum's gaps in her first week. She had said nothing. She filed it in the part of her mind that collected information the way a rifle collects zero, patiently, precisely, with the understanding that the moment to use it would arrive and would not wait. That moment was coming. She could read the signs the way she could read a thermal gradient over a heated airstrip, not with certainty but with the kind of probability that makes certainty redundant. The thing that was coming had a name. It was called Exercise Ironclad, and it was scheduled for the first week of March, and it involved a joint task force evaluation that would bring observers from SOCOM and a target set that the range cadre had, in Callahan's professional assessment, approximately no realistic plan to execute successfully. She kept the assessment to herself. She reorganized the wind data tables in the range office on a Tuesday morning when no one was watching, so that the most relevant variables were arranged in the order a shooter needed to access them rather than the order they had been entered. She rebuilt the ballistic drop compensators on 3 of the training rifles, whose zero had drifted past the threshold, where it affected accuracy in ways the shooters wouldn't notice until the distance exceeded 400 meters. She did these things quietly and without announcement, and then went back to her desk and her data. Sergeant First Class Anansley Torres noticed. Torres had been Foss's senior range NCO for 2 years, which meant she had been watching the program's limitations for 2 years, and had been making the specific calculations that a capable person makes when they exist inside a system that has decided they are not the authority. She noticed the wind tables on Wednesday. She noticed the rifle zeros on Thursday. She sat down next to Callahan at the data terminal on Friday morning and said, without preamble, "You adjusted the drop charts too." Callahan looked up. "They're in the documentation." "I checked the documentation. The adjustments aren't in the documentation." Torres held her gaze with the directness of someone who has learned that directness is a tool and is choosing to use it. They're just done, correctly, by someone who knows what they're doing. A pause. "How long have you been in ballistics?" Torres asked. Callahan considered which version of the answer to give. "A while," she said, Torres studied her the way a person studies something they've almost recognized. Before this assignment, Callahan confirmed and looked back at her screen. Torres did not leave. She pulled up her own data and stayed at the adjacent terminal and kept a peripheral attention on Callahan that felt less like surveillance and more like a choice. It was the kind of attention that says, I see what I'm looking at, even if I don't know what to call it yet. Callahan appreciated it. She did not show that she appreciated it. The weeks moved the way weeks move on a training base, with the rhythmic intensity of schedule and the slow accumulation of pressure that comes when a significant evaluation is approaching and the gap between current capability and required performance is narrowing faster than the training program is closing it. Foss drove the schedule harder. He ran more repetitions of the same drills. He added range days without adding anything new to what happened on them. It was the specific response of a man who confused volume with progress, who believed that doing the same thing more times would eventually produce a different result. It would not. Callahan knew this with the precision of someone who had spent years studying exactly why it would not, in contexts where the consequence of the miscalculation was not a failed evaluation, but something that came home with people or did not come home at all. She said nothing. She waited. She kept her head down and her work clean, and she helped the shooters who came to her desk with questions that Foss's curriculum hadn't answered, which was most of them eventually. They came quietly, the way junior soldiers come to someone they've identified as knowing something useful when the official channels have failed to provide it. A private named Grant, who couldn't understand why his groupings were drifting right at distance regardless of his trigger pull. A corporal named Mwangi, whose elevation compensation was correct at 300 meters and wrong at 6. They came with their data and their frustration, and she sat with them and worked through the physics and watched something happen in their understanding that she had seen before, in other rooms, in other configurations, the particular shift of a person who has been given the right frame for a problem they've been solving with the wrong one. Word moved through the junior, ranks the way useful information always moves, quietly, laterally, below the level that authority notices until it can no longer be ignored. Foss noticed in the third week of February. He noticed because 3 of his shooters had recorded qualifying scores they had not achieved in the previous 6 months of training, and he traced the improvement back to the data terminal. And the woman sitting at it, and the expression on his face when he made the connection, was the specific expression of a man who is pleased and threatened simultaneously and is not comfortable with the combination. He did not address it directly. Instead, he added Callahan to the range day roster for the following week with a target set that she had not been briefed on, a set that was, in the assessment of everyone who saw it, designed to be failed. Distances that pushed past what the program's current rifles were zeroed for, wind conditions that the available data tables didn't account for properly, an exercise structure that required calling corrections in real time using math that the curriculum had not covered. It was, in the specific language of the situation, a trap. Torres found out about the roster change on a Thursday afternoon and came to Callahan's desk with the expression of someone who has news they would rather not be delivering. Foss put you on the Saturday range evolution, she said. I know. Did you see the target set? Yes. Torres put her hand flat on the desk. It was a small gesture. It was the gesture of someone choosing to stay rather than to simply convey information and leave. The distances he's using are outside the standard 0 parameters for the M110s we have on hand. The wind call is going to require real-time calculation that isn't in the training package. I know, Callahan said again. Torres looked at her. Are you going to be able to do it? Callahan looked at the range diagram on her screen, the distances, the angles, the wind patterns that she had been quietly tracking for 3 weeks. Because wind on this specific stretch of land, at this specific elevation, behaved in a way that the official tables only partially captured. She had been building a correction model in the margins of her actual assignment because the margins were where truth lived when the official record was insufficient. Yes, she said. Torres studied her for one more moment. Then she nodded and went back to her own station. but she stayed late that afternoon, and Callahan noticed her running the range diagram through the same calculations, checking the work of someone she had decided to trust without yet having the evidence to justify the decision completely. It was the right instinct. Callahan filed it. Saturday arrived, with a front moving in from the northwest and a crosswind that hit the range at 22 miles per hour from the west, with a 4-mile-per-hour variable component from a terrain feature 200 meters to the south that the wind meters didn't capture because they were positioned for the standard range distances. Callahan had accounted for it. She had accounted for it 2 weeks ago when she first walked the terrain and read the way the air moved between the ridgeline and the concrete berm, with the attention of someone trained to read ballistic environments the way a navigator reads weather. Foss ran the evolution with the particular energy of a man who has designed a situation to prove a point. He briefed the conditions with deliberate underemphasis of the variables that he knew were going to cause problems. He called the wind at 19 miles per hour uniform, which was what the meter read, and was not what the range floor was experiencing. He positioned Callahan at the station with the greatest exposure to the terrain-generated variable wind. She set up without comment. She ran her own check of the conditions. She made 4 calculations in her head in approximately 90 seconds. Corrections for the density altitude, the actual crosswind at the firing position, the variable component, and the bullet's time of flight adjustment for the atmospheric conditions. And she dialed them into the scope with the efficiency of someone for whom this is not problem-solving but memory retrieval. The targets were at 800, 900, and 1,100 meters. She put the first round on the 800-meter target, then the 900, then the 1,100, which was past the effective zero of the rifle she was shooting and required a calculation that most trained snipers would have needed a ballistic calculator and 2 minutes to produce. She produced it in her head. The shot hit. Not close. On. Foss watched this. His expression did not change. The expression of a man who is recalibrating and does not want anyone to see him doing it. She ran the second string, then the third. The wind shifted twice during the third string, a gust up to 28 that dropped back to 21 in 4 seconds. She called both adjustments before the shots broke, calmly, without urgency, the way someone calls them when they've already done the math and are simply reporting the result. Torres was scoring at the target line. When the third string ended, Torres's voice came over the radio with the scores and then added, in the specific measured tone of someone choosing their words precisely, all hits. Groupings within standard for the conditions. The range went quiet. There were 6 other shooters in the evolution. They had heard every correction Callahan called. They had watched every adjustment. The junior ones were looking at her with the specific hunger of people who have just seen something done at a level they didn't know was available, and who are filing it against every training repetition they've been given as a point of comparison. Foss walked the range afterward with the clipboard he always carried and the expression of a man conducting a routine review. He stopped at Callahan's position last. Wind was different than the meter read, he said. Not a question. There's a terrain feature 200 meters south that creates a differential at this firing position, Callahan said. The meter placement doesn't capture it. He looked at her. How long have you known that? 3 weeks? A beat. The specific silence of a man receiving information that rearranges his timeline of events. You've been correcting for it. On the data I've been providing to the shooters, yes. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. 3. There was something working in his face that she had seen before in senior men who are confronting the gap between their self-assessment and an external data point. Sometimes it resolved into anger, sometimes into the more honest thing. The SOCOM evaluation is in 11 days, he said. I know. He tapped the clipboard against his leg twice. Then, what else do you know that I don't know? It was a better question than she had expected from him at that point. It was, actually, the right question. The question of someone who has chosen in the moment of reckoning to prioritize function over face. She told him. She gave it to him straight, in the order that mattered, the way she had been trained to brief people who need information rather than comfort. The curriculum gaps, the rifle zeros that had been corrected, The wind data tables. The three specific scenarios in the SOCOM evaluation profile that the current training approach would fail to prepare for, and the modifications that would address each one. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How do you know the SOCOM evaluation profile?" he asked. "The structure is standard for Joint Task Force assessments at this certification level," she said. "I've seen 3 of them." "Where?" She looked at him steadily. "Different ranges," she said, "in different conditions." He did not ask which conditions. She suspected he had begun to understand that the answer would require him to revise more than he was prepared to revise in the middle of a range evaluation. "I want you in the planning session Monday morning," he said. "Understood," she said. He walked away. She watched him go, and she felt nothing in particular because this was not the moment she had been waiting for. This was preliminary. This was the part where a capable authority figure adjusts after being shown the data. The moment she had been waiting for had a different shape and a different weight, and was, she suspected, still coming. The planning session on Monday was where the collision happened. Not with Foss, with Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Greer. Greer was the brigade commander for the 114th, which made him Foss's commanding officer and the senior military authority on the range evaluation. He was 53 and had the specific confidence of a man who had been evaluated and promoted and celebrated at every level of a 30-year career, which is a particular kind of confidence, because it had been systematically rewarded, and therefore systematically reinforced until the person carrying it can no longer distinguish between the confidence and the competence. He arrived at the Monday planning session with 2 staff officers, and the particular energy of a man who has been briefed that a problem exists and has arrived to solve it through the exercise of authority over the problem. He looked at the updated training plan that Callahan had put together. He looked at it the way people look at things they didn't ask for from people they didn't invite to the table. "Who put this together?" he said. "Specialist Callahan, sir," Foss said. "She identified several gaps in the current." "I see what she identified," Greer said. "Not to Callahan, to Foss. The specific performance of a man who processes a subordinate's presence by speaking about them to someone whose existence he has already registered. The evaluation is in 10 days. We don't restructure a program 10 days before a SOCOM evaluation." "Sir, the modifications are targeted." Callahan heard her own voice say it. She had not planned to speak at that moment, but she heard the moment close behind her own thought, and she spoke before it could. 3 specific scenarios in the evaluation profile require real-time wind correction that the current curriculum doesn't address. The modifications take 2 training days. We have 10. Greer looked at her. The way he looked at her was the look of a man who had just registered, for the first time, that a sound in the room was coming from a person rather than a background source. He registered her rank, her gender, her assignment designation. He ran a calculation that had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with the specific architecture of how he had learned to assess information by assessing its source. "Specialist," he said. "This is a brigade-level program with 3 years of development behind it." "Yes, sir. I've reviewed the development history. The wind data protocols were set in year 1, before the range terrain modification that changed the airflow pattern at the 700-plus meter positions." A silence. "The terrain was modified 18 months ago," she continued. "The wind protocol hasn't been updated. The gap is specific and correctable." Greer's jaw set in the way that jaws set when a person has decided that the argument they are in is about authority rather than accuracy. "Captain Foss," he said, "we run the program as designed. If there are refinements to consider after the evaluation, we consider them." "Sir," Foss started. "As designed," Greer said. He left. His staff officers followed him with the tide of his momentum. The room held what remained, which was the particular atmosphere that follows a decision made for the wrong reasons in a situation where the right reasons are sitting on the table and being deliberately not looked at. Foss set his pen down. He looked at Callahan. His expression contained something she had not seen there before, not agreement exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who is on the wrong side of a correct argument and knows it. "I'm sorry," he said. Not an elaborate apology, just the words. He's not wrong that the program has development history, she said. He's wrong about the rest of it. She didn't disagree. She looked at the updated plan on the table. The shooters can still run the real-time correction protocol if they've seen it, even informally. Foss picked his pen back up. I didn't hear you say that, he said. She nodded once and began rolling up the chart. The informal sessions happened in the 2 hours before the official range time, in the early mornings when the light was flat and the wind was honest and Foss was in his office. And the shooters were already there because they had heard, through the lateral communication system of junior ranks, that something useful was happening at 0600 that wasn't on the official schedule. Callahan ran them through it. Not a class, not a drill. A working session where the math was live and the conditions were real, and the point was to build the reflex rather than the knowledge. Because the reflex is what survives under pressure when the knowledge doesn't have time to load. Torres ran the target line. She did this without being asked, at 0600, before her own official day started, because she had made a decision about where her capability was being put to better use. By the fourth morning, 6 of the 8 shooters who would participate in the SOCOM evaluation had run the real-time correction at least twice, in conditions that approximated what the evaluation would require. By the 5th morning, 2 of them were doing it without prompting. On the 6th morning, the radio in the range office went live with a transmission that changed the temperature of the entire base in 4 sentences. The SOCOM evaluation had been moved up, not by days, by the full 10 days. A conflict in the joint assessment schedule had compressed the timeline. The evaluation team was arriving in 48 hours. Callahan was in the range office when the transmission came through. She heard it the way she heard all significant information, completely, without filtering, every word landing in sequence and being processed before the speaker finished. She stood very still. Around her, the office reorganized into controlled urgency. Foss on the phone, Torres pulling the evaluation protocol binder, staff officers materializing from somewhere and talking fast about logistics that were already determined by the situation and didn't require the talking. She ran the numbers, 48 hours, 2 range days if they compressed the schedule. The shooters had 4 of the 6 required repetitions. They needed 6 minimum for the correction reflex to hold under evaluation pressure. She could get them to 5. 5 was not 6. 5 was also not 0, which was where they had been 8 days ago. She moved to the staging area and began working. She pulled the wind data from the previous 6 days and built a projection for the next 48 hours. Using a model she had been developing since week 2, she identified the 2 highest risk scenarios in the evaluation profile and mapped the specific wind conditions each would require the shooters to correct for. She designed a compressed run-through that would give each shooter 1 high-fidelity repetition of both scenarios in a single range day, which was not how you built a reflex, but was how you gave one a fighting chance. Torres appeared at her elbow. Foss wants to know if you can have a modified evaluation prep ready in 2 hours. I'll have it in 90 minutes. He also wants, Torres stopped, reorganized. He also wanted me to tell you that Greer is going to be on the range tomorrow. Callahan looked up. He's joining the evaluation as an observer, Torres said. His call this morning. After the news about the timeline, the specific architecture of that decision arranged itself in Callahan's mind with the clarity of a ballistics solution. Greer was positioning himself near the outcome. If it went well, he would be present for it. If it went poorly, he would be positioned to explain why the last-minute disruption to his established program had caused the failure. It was not an unfamiliar move. She had seen its equivalent in rooms that looked very different from a range office on a training base in the middle of a February that was trending colder. She looked back at her data. I'll have it in 90 minutes, she said again. She did. She had it in 83 minutes, and it was complete, stage by scenario, with a time allocation for each repetition and a contingency column for the wind shift pattern she projected would hit at approximately 1400 hours based on the front that was still moving in from the northwest. Foss read it in 7 minutes. He looked up and said, "The contingency column. There's a front coming. The wind will shift at the 1400 range window if the system moves on the current track. The contingency builds in a variable correction run for the most likely shift pattern. He looked at her. You've been tracking the weather. I've been tracking the ballistic environment, she said. The weather is part of it. He nodded slowly. Something in his posture was different from the posture he had carried for the first 6 weeks she'd been at this base. Foss was a man who had been running a program he understood inside its own parameters, and he was arriving incrementally at the understanding that the parameters had been drawn too small. It looked uncomfortable on him. It also looked honest. Those things often go together. Run it, he said. The evaluation day came in cold and clear, the front having moved through overnight and left the kind of sky that looks clean and is in fact ballistically complex because cold air at density altitude behaves differently than the standard table assumes. Callahan was on the range at 0530. She had been tracking the overnight wind data from the 2 meters she had added to the range. Added quietly, 2 weeks ago using equipment she had requisitioned through a logistics request that described the purpose in technical language specific enough to be approved and general enough not to trigger a review. The SOCOM evaluation team arrived at 0800, 3 officers, a warrant officer who ran the practical assessment, and 2 NCOs who observed the range conduct. They set up without ceremony. They had the specific affect of people who have run enough evaluations to find routine pressure, boring, and genuine performance interesting. Greer arrived at 0815 with his 2 staff officers and the expression of a man who is attending an event that he has framed in his own mind as the natural culmination of his program. The evaluation ran in 4 blocks. The first 2 went well, not spectacularly, but within standard. The shooters were solid. The work that Callahan had been doing for 8 weeks was visible in their performance in the same way that a load-bearing wall is visible. Not directly, but in the fact that the things it's holding are not falling. The third block was the difficult one. 900-meter targets, variable wind, real-time correction required. It was in the evaluation structure, the moment of separation between a program that was technically compliant and one that actually functioned under pressure. The wind shifted at 13:58, 2 minutes ahead of Callahan's projection. She had built 2 minutes of contingency into the modified plan. The first shooter, a specialist named Grant, was already in position. He looked at the wind meter. He looked at the target. He looked at the correction card Callahan had built for the shift pattern, which was in his range notebook in the format she had taught him to use, organized for speed, staged in the order he would need the information. He made the adjustment. He broke the shot. It hit. The SOCOM warrant officer noted something on his clipboard. Grant ran the second shot. Hit. Third shot. Hit. The second shooter ran the string. Hit, hit, hit. The third shooter had a called wind variation that the correction card covered and an atmospheric pressure differential that it didn't. And Callahan was watching his setup from her position at the range edge, and she saw, in the angle of his body and the way he dialed the adjustment, that he was about to make the error that the card didn't protect against. She walked to him. Not quickly, the kind of movement that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. She said very quietly, below the level of the evaluation observers, "Your pressure altitude correction is standard table. It's wrong today by about 2 clicks." The air moved overnight. He looked at her. He trusted her. 8 weeks of accuracy had purchased that. He made the adjustment. He ran the string. Hit, hit, hit. The fourth block was individual performance, 1 shooter per scenario, no peer reference. The hardest block. The one where the reflex either held or it didn't. It held. Not perfectly. It never does. 2 shots that should have been better. 1 adjustment that was slow. But the standard for joint qualification is not perfection. The standard is functional accuracy under real conditions. And what the range produced that afternoon was functional accuracy under real conditions because the people performing had been trained by someone who understood the difference between curriculum compliance and actual preparation. The SOCOM warrant officer spoke to Foss at the end of the 4th block. Callahan was across the range, conducting the post-evaluation equipment check, and could not hear the conversation, but she could read it from the body language. Foss straightening slightly, the warrant officer writing something extended rather than something brief. The NCO observers comparing notes in a way that looked like confirming rather than questioning. Greer was watching all of it from the observation platform. His expression was the expression of a man recalibrating in real time and doing it faster than she had expected him to, which revised her assessment of him upward. Not far, but upward. Torres appeared beside her at the equipment table. Warrant said it's a strong pass, she said. First clean qualification this unit has gotten on the advanced standard in 18 months. Callahan checked the scope on the third rifle. Good. Torres was quiet for a moment. He's going to ask where the preparation came from. The preparation came from the unit, Callahan said. These shooters did the work. Torres looked at her with the directness that had been present since the first morning at the data terminal. You know that's not the complete answer. No, Callahan said, but it's the right one to say first. She finished the equipment check. She began the documentation, the range log, the environmental data, the correction model she had built over 8 weeks and which she would leave in the range office formatted for the next analyst who needed it. Clear, precise, annotated for the specific terrain features that the previous documentation had missed. The kind of record that tells the story of what happened to anyone who wasn't there. She was writing the range environmental summary when she heard footsteps behind her that had a different cadence than the range staff's. Military footsteps, but not the base staff's rhythm. An external pattern, the particular cadence of people who have been somewhere else recently and are carrying it in the way they move. She kept writing. Torres appeared at her shoulder. She said nothing. She simply stood there in the way that people stand when they are telling you without words that something is happening behind you that matters. Callahan finished the sentence she was writing. She saved it. She turned. There were 2 of them. Civilian dress, but the kind of civilian dress that is a costume rather than a wardrobe. Worn correctly, all the right pieces, but with precision that civilian clothes are not usually worn with by people who came to civilian clothes naturally. Behind them, a woman in uniform. Not the brigade's uniform. A different branch marking, a different tier of presence entirely. Command Sergeant Major Evelyn Morse. Callahan looked at Morse. Morse looked at Callahan. Between them across the width of the range office passed the specific recognition of 2 people who have operated in close proximity under significant pressure and carry the memory of it in the part of memory that does not let go. Callahan, Morse said. Sergeant Major, Callahan said. The range office stopped. Foss, who had come back inside and was at the far desk, stopped moving. Torres, who was unflappable under most conditions, went still. Grant, who was at the equipment rack, looked from Callahan to the CSM and back with the expression of someone whose category for the situation has just been revised entirely. Morse walked toward her. Her bearing was the bearing of someone who had made 40 rooms adjust to her presence and found the 41st one no different from the others. She stopped 2 feet from Callahan and looked at her for a moment with the total attention of someone who has a great deal to say and is choosing the order carefully. I got the range report from the evaluation team, she said. I came myself. The unit performed well, Callahan said. They did, Morse said. I understand the performance came together in the last 8 days. The last 8 weeks, Callahan said. The 8 days were the final step. Something moved through Morse's expression, not surprise, confirmation. The specific look of someone receiving information that verifies what they already believed. 8 weeks. Working inside a curriculum that didn't support what you were doing. Working within the available framework, Callahan said. A pause. Greer pulled the wire, Morse said. The phrase meant what it meant in contexts they had both been in. He intervened. He shut it down. He used the authority at his disposal to stop something that should have been allowed to proceed. He made the call he had the authority to make, Callahan said. The unit found a way. Morse studied her. You found a way. Callahan did not argue with that. The unit executed it. Greer appeared at the range office entrance. He had come in from the evaluation debrief, and he saw Morse, and he recalibrated, visibly quickly, because CSMs who arrive at a range evaluation after the debrief are not appearing for social reasons, and his 30 years of service had taught him to read that accurately if nothing else. Sergeant Major Morse, he said, carefully. Morse turned. Colonel Greer. She let the pause do what pauses do in military contexts, carry weight without words. Strong evaluation result for your unit. The program has been well developed, Greer said. Morse looked at him with the measured precision of someone who has heard a statement and is deciding how much of what they know to deploy in response. The program benefited from some additional analysis over the past weeks, she said. I understand there were some questions about whether to implement the analytical recommendations. Greer's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but the shift was there. In the timeline available, the standard approach produced a pass, Morse said. Yes. She held his gaze for exactly long enough, and the recommendations have been documented for future implementation. That's noted in the evaluation report as well. Greer looked at Callahan. It was a different look from the looks he had given her before. Not warmer exactly, more accurate. The look of a man who has received information that has corrected a calibration error and who is processing the correction. The recommendation documentation, he said. That's yours. It's in the range file, Callahan said, for whoever comes next. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face that was not quite anything she had a name for. Not apology, not gratitude, something in between those things and also more complicated than either. It should have been implemented sooner. She looked at him steadily. It's implemented now. The next evaluating unit will have it from day one. He absorbed this, he nodded once. He went back to the debrief. Foss was watching from the far desk. He had his coffee in his hand, and the look of a man observing something that is reorganizing his understanding of the room he has been working in and doing it with more honesty than she might have predicted from him 8 weeks ago. Morse waited until Greer was outside. Then she turned back to Callahan, and the register of her voice changed. Not the authority leaving, but the performance of it setting down for a moment, the specific shift between the professional and the actual. You are going to finish the 90 days and leave, she said. I was going to finish the 90 days, Callahan confirmed. I'm going to have to write a report about today, I know. Your name is going to be in it, I know. Morse almost smiled. All of it, Callahan. Whatever the report requires. The almost smile completed itself briefly, the real version of it, the compressed warmth of two people who have worked in hard conditions alongside each other and have the kind of knowledge of each other that survives everything the official record reduces it to. I want to talk to you about what comes after the 90 days. I know, Callahan said. Not tonight. I have 2 days on base. We'll talk. Yes, ma'am. Morse looked at her for a moment with the total precision of 12 years behind it. You can't disappear, Claire. She used the name. The first name, the one that existed underneath the rank and the file number, and the single-line entry that said Special Assignment, Details Restricted. You tried that already. You reorganized the wind tables in week 1. Callahan looked at the range floor, the targets at distance, the terrain that she had read and mapped and understood better than the people who had been here 3 years before she arrived. I needed to know something, she said. What? She was quiet for a moment. The cold from outside was in the building now, the real February cold that doesn't negotiate. I needed to know if the work was in me or in the structure, if I could do what I do without the infrastructure, without the support assets and the cleared equipment and the team whose entire job was to make sure I had what I needed when I needed it. Morse was very still. And, she said. Callahan looked at her. It's in me. Morse nodded. Slowly. The nod of someone receiving an answer they already knew but needed to hear in the right words from the right person. I know, she said. I also know it's not in you to leave it where it is. Grant appeared at the range office door. His face was still carrying the afternoon. The evaluation, the wind shift, the adjustment he had made on information he had chosen to trust. He looked at the CSM. He looked at Callahan. He read the room with the speed of a young soldier who is becoming more of what they are under the pressure of a situation that required it. Sergeant Major, he said, uncertain of the protocol. Specialist Grant, Morse said. Strong performance today, thank you, ma'am. He looked at Callahan, the contingency column in the win card, the 2-minute early shift. He paused. How did you know? Callahan considered the question. The front was moving on a specific track. The terrain here deflects that track in a predictable way once the temperature drops past a certain point. It crossed that point at 0300. You were tracking it at 0300? I was tracking it when the front entered the regional system, she said. You check the variables when the variables matter. He held that for a moment. Then he nodded, with the slowness of someone integrating something that is larger than its immediate application. Yes, ma'am, he said. He went back to the equipment rack. Torres was at the end of the office. She had been listening with the patience of someone who has been watching a long equation reach its solution and is not surprised by the answer, but is not unmoved by it either. She looked at Callahan with the directness that had been there since the first Friday morning at the data terminal. What happens now? She said. I finished the 90 days, Callahan said. Torres looked at Morse. Morse looked at Torres with the measuring assessment of someone whose professional skill is evaluating people in compressed time. When she's done, Morse said, if you want to continue the conversation about the advanced qualification program, my office is the place to start. Torres looked at her with the careful stillness of someone trying not to show how much that sentence matters. The advanced qualification program at which installation? Fort Liberty. Joint integration track. We've been building it 18 months. Morse held Torres's gaze. We've been waiting for it to be ready. It's ready. Torres looked at Callahan. Callahan looked back. Talk to the sergeant major, Callahan said. The range office cleared in the way that spaces clear after a significant event, gradually, with the residue of what happened still present in the air and the equipment and the specific quality of silence that follows. Foss was the last one through, after the SOCOM team, after Torres, after the two civilians in their precise civilian clothes. He stopped at the door. He had his jacket on and his battered range bag and the expression of a man at the end of a day that has been longer than its hours. The wind data system you built, he said. The 2 additional meters. The correction model. It's all documented, she said, in the range file. It's going to take someone who understands it to use it correctly. The documentation is specific, she said. Someone who knows what they're looking for will be able to use it. He looked at her. I didn't know what I was looking for when you got here. No, she said, but you asked the right question on the range when it mattered. He thought about that. He nodded once. He went to his car. The range was quiet. The lights in the target frames were off. The February dark was coming in fast, the way it does at this latitude, with the specific brevity of short days that feel like an argument about how little light the season is willing to give. Callahan stood in it. She let the cold work through the last of the afternoon, the weight of the evaluation, the particular expenditure of a day that had required everything she had and had been worth the expenditure. She was tired in the way she recognized the real kind, the kind that means the work was done at the level it needed to be done. She thought about Grant making the adjustment on information he had chosen to trust before he had sufficient evidence. She thought about Torres at 0600 running the target line before the official day started, for reasons that had nothing to do with her assignment and everything to do with her judgment. She thought about Foss asking the right question on the range rather than the self-protecting one. She thought about a report landing on a table and being picked up without anger, not because the person picking it up was diminished, because they understood that the work is not the acknowledgement. The work is the work. Morse found her there 2 minutes later, and they stood together in the dark of the range with the scored targets at distance and the corrected wind meters and the documentation file on the server that would be there for the next analyst who needed to know what this terrain actually did when a front came through. I'm going to ask you something, Morse said. Not as an order, ask, Callahan said. The joint integration program. The real version of it, not what it's been on paper. We need someone to build the actual curriculum from the ground up. Someone who knows the difference between what the tables say and what the air is doing. Someone who can teach that difference to people who haven't been in the rooms where it matters. Callahan looked at the range, the distance, the precise dark shapes of the targets against the last flat light. The 90 days, she said, will be complete before we need your answer. She was quiet for a long time. Inside the range office, she could hear the building settling into its night sounds, the mechanical continuity of a structure that exists for a purpose and goes on existing for it whether or not anyone is currently performing that purpose inside it. On my terms, she said finally. Name them, The curriculum gets built right, which means it takes longer than the timeline probably wants. Tell me the timeline you need, she told her. Morse did not argue with it. Morse had not, in 12 years, argued with Callahan's assessment of the time required to do something correctly, which was one of the primary reasons that 12 years of working in the same difficult conditions had produced the specific trust that now existed between them. Then yes, Callahan said. Morse nodded. Once. The nod of someone receiving a decision from someone who makes decisions the way decisions should be made. Not in heat, not under pressure, not for reasons that belong to someone else. From the full and clear possession of themselves. She went to her car. Callahan stood in the dark for another moment. She had never needed the range to know her name. She had never needed the curriculum to acknowledge what she had corrected. She had needed to know that the thing she was, the specific combination of mathematical precision and operational patience, and the particular kind of courage that shows itself in small adjustments rather than large announcements, was in her rather than in the structure around her. She knew that now. She picked up her range bag. She checked the office lock. She walked to her car in the specific dark of a February evening at a training base in a quiet part of the country that would, starting in 8 weeks, begin producing shooters who understood the difference between what the tables say the wind is doing and what the wind is actually doing, because someone had been patient enough to teach them, quietly without announcement, in the margins of an assignment that officially asked for much less than she had given it. She had always given more than was asked. She had simply stopped advertising the fact that, she had learned, was not a limitation. It was the whole point.